Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger. Welcome to our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and chairman of the Schiller Institute. It's June 2nd, 2021, and we're in the midst of a very dense period of political, economic, social developments. Why don't we start with the story that's been hyped a lot in the Western media, the so-called Wuhan leak story, which is coming from, not surprisingly, the same sources that were responsible for so many other false stories and fabrications. But Helga, what do you make of this story?
Well, it is very important to keep a historic memory. I mean, a lot of our supporters and contacts have said in the recent period that the whole strategic picture is so confusing that it's very difficult to differentiate, what is true, what is wrong, and they are mainly at a loss. And that has a reason. The reason is that there is such an enormous amount of psychological warfare coming from the war party that a normal person, normal citizen who is not really trying to really find the truth almost is lost, and that has a method. Now, the story you just referred to is the story that the COVID-19 originated in a lab, in a virological lab in Wuhan, and that it was maybe not intentional, but in any case, the Chinese covered that up and therefore are responsible for the COVID crisis and the economic damage which resulted out of it. So this is an unbelievable story. This appeared recently, May 23rd, in the Wall Street Journal, and it was written by two characters, one Michael Gordon and Judith Miller, and they basically reiterated that story. Then 2 days later, it was picked up by the U.S. Secretary for Health, Becerra, and then 1 day later, President Biden said that he ordered a 90-day investigation by the U.S. intelligence community, that they should investigate this, and find out if this was coming from this Wuhan lab. Now, first of all, this story was not mentioned for the first time by the Wall Street Journal, but already last June, the former head of MI6, Sir Dearlove, basically had come out with the same accusation, saying, that if China, if it turns out that they are responsible for this virus, they have to pay reparation, and now the story is all over. I mean, every tabloid, every newspaper is peddling this story. And therefore, it is extremely important to look at who are these journalists who wrote this story. Well, it is exactly the same people who in 2002 in the Wall Street Journal wrote the story about the so-called weapons of mass destruction of Saddam Hussein, the so-called aluminium pipes, which supposedly Saddam Hussein imported to build centrifuges to build a nuclear bomb. Now, well, that, if people remember, led to the Iraq War. As a result, hundreds of thousands of Iraqis were killed, and several thousand US soldiers were killed. And it turned out that there were no weapons of mass destruction, that the whole thing was a hoax. Now, the question arises, should not irresponsible journalists, who are obviously not journalists at all, but who are, riders or instruments of that faction of, the geopolitical war party, who want to have a confrontation with China, with Russia. And, if they would have the same, in quote, success, like they did with the weapons of mass destruction story in respect to Saddam Hussein, it could lead to a war between the United States and China. And, there are many people who have warned in the recent period that if such a war would occur, the likelihood that it would go nuclear is very high. So the question to be asked is, if these people, such individuals, can they get away with murder? Because, the consequences of such scribblers, such liars, such manipulators, is the price is being paid by hundreds of thousands of people in the case of Iraq. And, I really think that there should be an investigation, and possibly a criminal investigation, of what is the real background behind these people writing such stories. We had recently another story, I think it was in Newsweek, that there are 60,000 individuals belonging to an army which has no oversight in the Congress nor anywhere else, and they are concerned with cyber war, many of them sitting at desks, manipulating the internet, planting false stories, doing all kinds of things. And that is obviously part of a hybrid war, but there is no declaration of war. So, I really think this is so scandalous that I would really urge that there must be an immediate international investigation in the United Nations, in parliaments. In any case, this story must not go through, because if it would lead to a war between the United States and China, as the war against Iraq and the murder of Saddam Hussein occurred, the consequences could be the annihilation of civilization. And I think these people, Michael Gordon and Judith Miller, they must be investigated for what they did in the case of Iraq, who all told them, what were the circumstances, and what makes them to try to repeat the same story now. I think this is a huge scandal.
Just one correction on Gordon. The 2002 story was actually in the New York Times. He was at the Times for 30 something years before he shows up at the Wall Street Journal. The other interesting point you made is the role of Sir Richard Dearlove, who came forward with the so-called Wuhan leak story well over a year ago. He was one of the people, when he was head of MI6, who pushed the fake weapons of mass destruction story. So it's absolutely the same people involved. Now, speaking of the same people, we have a recurring story which goes back to 2013 of NSA spying. At the time, it was reported that the NSA was wiretapping Angela Merkel's cell phone. This just emerged again, but there's some new twists to it, Helga, including the role of Denmark working with the National Security Agency. What's the full story that you have on this?
Well, that is another scandal, because it reveals something about the political reality in which we live, the so-called rules-based order. Every time I hear that word, rules-based order, if it wouldn't be so sad, you could start laughing. But, you better think that one of the rule is, even if you are caught, it doesn't mean anything. Because this story about the NSA spying on European politicians came out the first time in 2013. Maybe many people may remember that Chancellor Merkel said, "Oh, spying among friends, that doesn't go at all." Well, then essentially nothing happened. The same scandal broke again in 2015 in Denmark, where it was revealed that the Danish Secret Service was collaborating with the NSA on such spy operations. Nothing came out of it, and it broke out last year again. Nothing happened. So apparently, there is one or more whistleblowers in the Danish Secret Service who got very upset for very similar reasons, I would assume. I haven't talked to them, but that's what it looks like Edward Snowden, who basically, these are people working as Secret Service agents, and then they realize that whole operation is being done for something quite different than the defense of the country. So these whistleblowers, or that one whistleblower, basically again came out, but this time he worked with a whole international network of journalists in Sweden, Norway, Germany, some other countries, and he provided them with the documents proving that such a collaboration exists. Now, this is incredible. I mean, the fact that, the Danish Secret Service and probably some top politicians, because these things very seldom happen without that, the prime minister or whatever knows about it. Obviously, rather than telling the European allies, I mean, this is after all people we are supposed to be with in the Union, rather than telling them, they didn't. They did not inform Merkel, Steinmeier, Steinbrück at the time. So obviously for them to be accepted in the club of the Five Eyes, the Seven Eyes, or whatever eyes you may count, was more important than to protect the interest of their own citizens, the Danish people, and naturally also the allies within the European Union. So rather be a slave of the master than being thrown out of the club. I mean, that shows a completely despicable uh, attitude. And I think the Serbian President Vucic, I think he put it in the right terms, because he said this is an incredible scandal. It means there are no rules, no international law, no morality. And that is unfortunately what is being revealed by this affair. So again, I think that there must be an outcry, because I mean, the same day, this is the other funny story, the same day this new Danish scandal broke, the German first channel, ARD, they had a big documentary about the Chinese surveillance state, the use of artificial intelligence and digitalization, in payment, in transport, in just all aspects of life, which, is indeed true. China is much more advanced in these areas than what I have seen anywhere in the West. But the difference is the Chinese population trusts their government. 95% are in agreement with what the government does, according to a study of Harvard. And, that is why the whole thing looks very different. But, with the NSA spying, this has been revealed, and we discussed it many times, by such people as Bill Binney and Ray McGovern and other people of the VIPs, the Veterans for Sanity in Intelligence, who basically, became whistleblowers for the very same reason like Edward Snowden. And what they reported is that what the NSA does is they collect simply everything, every phone call, every email, every electronic motion anywhere is being recorded and taped and stored. They have gigantic storage capacities I think it's in Utah and elsewhere. And then, they have all this data from the whole world. And whenever they want to find something later, they filter it and they can find it for eternity. Now, that means there is absolutely no respect for privacy, no respect for, all the treaties, supposedly protecting the population in terms of their personal information. That is all, a complete lie. Again, when I hear rules-based order, then one better thinks about the NSA, because that's part of the rules. So this, I mean, the more you find out how this whole, public debate is being orchestrated, it really is, it's reaching a point where people should really wake up, because we are looking at the danger of a global dictatorship. And then if you take some of the green stuff in addition to that, I mean, we are looking towards a complete hell if people don't wake up and say enough is enough.
Well, and one of the stories that's also emerging that's important in this is the Chatham House now rewriting history. And Chatham House is also setting up a spy operation to monitor the carbon footprint of other countries. So once again, it comes back to the British. But this rewriting of history is really significant, especially given the importance of the NATO summit and the confrontation between the West and Russia that's being promoted by this. What do the Chatham House reports say?
Well, they want to dismantle the many myths about NATO and Russia by saying that there was never any discussion about not moving NATO to the borders of Russia in the context of the German unification. This was never an issue because the Soviet Union still existed and therefore nobody thought about it. And that's just plain a lie. Because if you go to the US National Security Archives, they have published a lot of written documentation about this period. And there were clearly written and verbal promises made to Gorbachev by Baker, the foreign minister, secretary of foreign affairs, or the State Department representative at the time. Then also US Ambassador Matlock, but also Genscher, I think Horst Telschik. There are several witnesses of this time who have absolutely contradicted this story. And, it's one of these stories which have only one purpose: to basically knit a narrative suitable for a future confrontation. But, this needs to be picked up, and I call on historians to, and honest journalists, in case there are still some, to really pick up this story and set the record straight.
We have the coming up now of the NATO summit and the G7 summit, and there are meetings going on where they're talking about the importance of being prepared to confront Russia and China. But Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov has had some very interesting and sharp comments on this. I wonder if you can just comment on the two things coming together.
Yeah, I mean, Foreign Minister Lavrov met with the ambassador of Portugal. Portugal is the present president of the EU, and a delegation of the European Union. And he said the situation between the EU and Russia is absolutely alarming. There is a complete loss of trust. And, he said it can be reversed, but it means that, completely different principles have to be introduced. And naturally, the big test will be indeed the upcoming two summits, the NATO summit, which is supposed to establish also for NATO a rules-based order, whatever that is supposed to mean. And at the upcoming G7 meeting, to which, among others, President Biden will travel, that is supposed to present, let's see what it will be exactly, an alternative to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. Now, there is no money yet available. It's also not clear where it is supposed to come from. But it's also not clear where this alternative Belt and Road Initiative is supposed to be built, because the Europeans want to have it in Africa. The United States want to have it in Latin America, and Japan want to have it in Asia. So what they will probably do is to issue some guidelines and, have a lot of both summits can be expected to have a lot of rhetoric against the dictatorships and authoritarian regimes of Russia, China, and some others. But, I cannot see how from these two bodies anything can come which addresses the real problems, which are many in the world.
And one of those problems is the problem of hyperinflation, which we've been warning about for quite a while, related to the quantitative easing and the just flood of liquidity that's not there for saving the real economy, but bailing out the deeply indebted banks and corporations. The hyperinflation is also hitting in Europe, and I wonder if you have some thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, as you say, we have been the only ones saying that this QE, money pumping, zero interest rate, negative interest rate, that you can do that for a very long time, but eventually it will explode into a hyperinflation, as it did in 1923 when the Reichsbank printed money to pay both the war debt and the reparation, to France, Britain, and so forth. For a long time, you didn't see anything. But then starting in the summer of 23, the inflation started to skyrocket, and then it went into a hyperbolic ratio. And by November, it was, people were bringing money by the wheelbarrows to the baker because it changed every day. And then it was ended. Now, this is not one country like it was in Weimar Germany. This is now practically the whole world. And it's very interesting that Global Times had an editorial where they warned that this excessive money creation by the Federal Reserve is now spilling over, threatening to affect the whole world with their hyperinflationary effects, and that countries should guard themselves against these effects. Now, the inflation issue and hyperinflationary issue is now out everywhere. Even tabloids like Bild Zeitung in Germany are warning that the savings of the pensioners will be eaten up by this inflation. The official inflation target by the ECB is 2%. In Germany, it's already officially 2.4%. But that is obviously not the real story, because if you go, for example, in everything having to do with oil and oil-related production, then you get inflation rates of 40, 50%. And for example, biofuels like maize has over 100% inflation. And this is clearly getting out of control. And then with that goes a crisis of shortage in materials. So the entire construction sector in Germany, for example, and probably other European countries as well, has incredible shortages. There is a lack of wood, of other materials. Trucks cannot be repaired because the spare parts are not coming. So, I think that it really shows that the economic situation is much, much more fragile. And, there is normally a delay factor between when commodity prices, go up and then consumer prices. But we are now reaching the point where, this is clearly becoming very visible, and it should be a reason for utmost of concern. This is why at the next conference of the Schiller Institute, which will be on the 26th and 27th, and you should reserve the date and register for it, the issue of hyperinflation and the necessary instruments against it, namely to implement the global Glass-Steagall banking separation law and the other 4 laws of Linden-LaRouche, that will be a major subject of that conference. And you should, if you really are concerned how to save your money, you should listen to that conference and not to the gold bugs, because they will try, to make money out of this situation. But we will discuss at this conference the only realistic way how the livelihood and life work of literally billions of people can be protected. Because if there is a hyperinflationary coming on internationally, it will affect every economy, even those who have relative capital restrictions. They will be hit because it will have a tremendous impact on the world market. So come to this conference and definitely join our forces.
And you can register for that at theschillerinstitute.com. And there's an ad right on the front page there on the home page, so you can join that. Now, while we're talking about this, we have the other green scandal, which is the attempt to create a new financial bubble, a green financial bubble. And at the center of that is the former head of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, who's now selling these certificates, these carbon certificates. This is completely crazy because the policy is openly now no development in the south of the southern hemisphere. This is the ultimate imperial policy, isn't it?
Well, it's a pretty outrageous and naked effort to reintroduce colonialism, because what Mark Carney is proposing, for Africa in particular, that they should sign agreements to not develop their resources, to even reforest their area land, and then basically get some money from the certificate trading, whereby they sell their certificates to firms in the West who have production and CO2 emissions. This is an incredible story. It basically is if you look at these different aspects, a an agreement for the third world not to develop. The present head of MI6, his name is Richard Moore. He says MI6 will police that, internationally, that these agreements are being fulfilled. And then you have the G7 wanting to come up with an alternative Belt and Road Initiative, which means no large infrastructure, for sure not the kind of industrial parks what China is building. I mean, this is an outrageous effort to reintroduce the old colonial system with modern means. And under conditions of a pandemic and world famine, it means massive depopulation. So, since the developing sector are very vulnerable and they're not, so strong to resist these things, I think it does require an open discussion, because this is too much.
And as almost everything we've discussed so far today has some outrageous element to it, we need to pick up the outrage in the political situation in Germany, where you have the Green Party pushing the depopulation policy of the green financial bubble that you just discussed, but also a war policy. And this is Habeck, who is contesting for the chancellor candidate and lost, but they're obviously in an alliance for these crazy policies.
Well, I mean, Baerbock spoke recently at the Atlantic Council, and the Atlantic Council had a headline afterwards, Annalena Baerbock in sync with Joe Biden. And that is unfortunately absolutely the case. And the Atlantic Council, as such, is a think tank which represents the military-industrial complex completely. If you look at the list of people who are in the board and advisory board, it's a good representation of the military-industrial complex. And therefore, in a certain sense, it's not surprising that Habeck went to Ukraine, met with President Zelensky, and supported the sale of weapons to Ukraine in complete violation of even the Green program, which says no weapons should be sold to areas of war, which Ukraine clearly is. And naturally, Zelensky is now saying, "Oh, I demand that Germany should sell weapons to Ukraine," which really is an outrage. If you think about what happened 80 years ago, 75 years ago, Germany should not be enticed into selling weapons into war zones. I mean, this is so outrageous that only if people are completely oblivious to history that you could even make such an outrageous proposal. But even some of the Green members now can see that this is really a complete outrage. So one can only hope that in time, the character of this new leadership of the Greens, I mean, naturally, I was never a friend of the Greens, but compared to these people, Petra Kelly was a sweetheart.
Well, as you just pointed out, it's not just that they're selling weapons or offering to sell weapons to Ukraine, but knowing that those weapons will go to Nazi units inside Ukraine's defense and security forces makes the point even more extreme. So, Helga, is there anything else you wanted to cover?
No, I think what we discussed is a lot of food for thought. And, I know people like now to go to vacation and have a break from COVID. But unfortunately, the subjects we touched upon are not going to go to the beach. They're going to stay with the world. And that's why we need thinking people who want to take responsibility as state citizens, because there is the biggest lack of right now. But that is why we will have a very, very important conference with the upcoming Schiller conference. And this is a forum where an alliance of anti-Malthusian people from many parts of the world get together, and you should be one of them.
And again, you can go to the schillerinstitute.com to register June 26th and June 27th. And Helga, thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you again next week.
Till next week.